Welcome to Echo Forge, dark fantasy and sci-fi stories from the edges of forgotten worlds. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next vision. Now, let's step through the gate. The Eidolon freight hauler wasn't built to be pretty. It was built to survive long lanes, bad maps, and colonies that ordered supplies the way drowning people order air. A long cylinder of patched alloy and modular bays, it carried nutrient bricks, med gel, printed parts, seed vaults, and, because the frontier hated waste, one environmental upgrade the contract writers had been excited about: moss-based carbon scrubbing. They called it the biofilter, a living carpet of engineered moss inside clear tanks, fed by humidity and trace nutrients, pulling CO2 from ship air with the kind of smug efficiency that made accountants smile. The moss also sat beside the hydroponics bay like a friendly cousin. The ship was supposed to feel alive. For the first 2 weeks, it did. Then the hydroponics bay started to smell wrong. Not rot, not mildew. Something sharper, metallic, like someone had struck a wet stone with a blade. Chief botanist Imani Kade noticed it during her morning checks. She didn't panic. Plants got weird in transit. Stress responses, light cycle hiccups, fungal blooms. You corrected, you logged, you moved on. But the smell wasn't logged, because the first thing she saw was the roots. The lettuce racks were vertical, stacked in drawers. The roots were supposed to hang neat and white in nutrient mist. Instead, they'd thickened, braided together in a way she'd never tuned for. They weren't reaching for water. They were reaching sideways, toward the biofilter tanks. Imani leaned closer and watched one root tip twitch. A tiny motion, like a worm deciding whether to wake up. "Okay," she muttered into her recorder, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. "Unscheduled growth behavior in hydroponics rack A. Possible phototropism anomaly. Checking." The ship's intercom pinged once, soft, routine. "Cade," came Captain Rourke's voice. "Status check. We're running a little high on CO2. Biofilter readings, jittery." Imani glanced at the biofilter display. The sensor graph wasn't a line. It was a nervous scribble. "Probably calibration drift," she said, "because that was what you said when you wanted something to be true." "I'll check the bay." She crossed the bay toward the biofilter tanks, 4 long transparent cylinders lined against a bulkhead, each filled with layered moss mats held in frames like vertical loaves of green bread. Air intake ducts ran through them. Fans pulled ship air through, CO2 in, oxygen out. At least, that was the model. She put her hand against the nearest tank. It felt warm. Living systems ran warm, sure. But the biofilter wasn't supposed to feel like skin. Imani leaned in. Through the glass, the moss wasn't flat. It had texture, raised ridges, pulsing faintly, as if something under it was breathing. Her throat tightened. She tapped the tank wall with her knuckle. The moss rippled, not from the vibration, toward the sound. A slow, purposeful shiver across the mat. Imani stepped back. "Rourke," she said into comms, voice low. "I'm seeing abnormal motility in the biofilter, like stimulus response." A pause. Somewhere else on the ship, a chair creaked. A human swallowing. "Is it dangerous?" Rourke asked. Imani looked at the moss again. It was pressed against the inner wall now. Not everywhere, just where her hand had been. Like it wanted warmth. "Not sure," she said. I'm going to isolate the bay. Recommend we switch to canister scrubbers until I can run diagnostics. Do it, Rourke said. And Kade, don't touch it. Imani's mouth twitched in a humorless half-smile. Too late. She turned to the control panel and began sealing vent dampers to isolate the hydroponics bay from ship circulation. A hiss answered her, air valves cycling. Then, behind her, glass clicked. A small sound, like a fingernail against a window. Imani froze. She turned slowly. Inside the tank, the moss had sprouted something that wasn't moss. A thin, pale filament, almost translucent, had risen from the mat and pressed against the glass. It thickened, then split at the tip into delicate branching forks. It looked like a hand learning what a hand was. Imani's heart hit her ribs, hard enough to hurt. She backed away, careful not to move too fast, as if she was in the presence of an animal that hadn't decided what she was yet. Her boot caught a wet patch on the deck. She looked down, a slow smear of green, like someone had dragged a paintbrush. But there hadn't been any spill. The tanks were sealed. Imani looked back at the biofilter and saw the truth with a cold clarity. The moss wasn't only in the tanks anymore. It had found the seams. It had found the drains. It was leaving. By the end of the day, CO2 level stabilized because Chief Engineer Vance Mora bypassed the biofilter and dropped old-fashioned chemical scrubbers into the circulation loop. The crew sighed with relief. They were good at that. Believing relief meant safe. Rourke ordered the hydroponics bay sealed and put Kade on remote monitoring only. No one entered without a partner, and no one entered at all until Mora rigged a sterilization flood, UV, heat, aerosol biocide. It's moss, Mora said, rolling his shoulders like he could shrug off fear. It's engineered moss, but still moss. We bake it, we bleach it, we move on. Imani didn't argue, not out loud, but in her cabin she replayed what she'd seen. The filament pressing the glass, branching like fingers. That wasn't moss. That was something borrowing moss as a starting language. She tried to sleep anyway. Frontier runs were long. The mind made monsters from boredom. Half an hour into restless darkness, her bunk's console pinged. Hydroponics Bay, Microcam 3, motion detected. Imani sat up, heart instantly awake. She tapped the feed. The camera view was grainy green. Hydroponics racks in the distance. The biofilter tanks along the right wall like silent aquariums. At first, she saw nothing. Then the moss moved. Not a ripple, not a tremor. A curling, like a muscle flexing under skin. Something slim and rope-like slid out from under the lowest hydroponics drawer and flowed across the deck. It wasn't a vine. It didn't grow as it moved. It moved as a whole thing, like a creature. It reached the sealed bay door. It paused. Then it rose. Imani's stomach fell as she watched it feel the door seam with delicate probing tendrils, searching like a blind hand. It found the sensor plate. It pressed. The door didn't open. Lockouts were hard-coded. But the tendril didn't withdraw. It throbbed faintly, almost impatient. Then it did something that made Imani forget to breathe. It bled. A clear sap beaded along it, then darkened to green-black as it soaked into the sensor plate. The sap spread like ink into tiny cracks, into the wiring channels. The lock status light flickered. Imani slammed her comm. "Rourke, wake up. It's in the door systems." They gathered in the corridor outside hydroponics. Captain Rourke, Engineer Mora, Medic son of Ellis, and Imani. 4 tired faces under emergency strip lighting. 4 people pretending this was still a problem with a manual. Mora crouched at the access panel beside the hydroponics door. "It shouldn't be able to interface," he said, voice tight. "The sensor's inert." Imani showed the microcam feed. The tendril, the sap, the flickering lock. Sana's face drained a shade. "That looks like biofilm." "It's conductive," Mora murmured, suddenly not as certain. "If it's saline enough, it could bridge contacts. Fake a human touch." "Can it open the door?" Rourke asked. Mora swallowed. "Not unless it's learned our authorization pattern." A faint click sounded from the door. All 4 of them looked at it. The lock light blinked once, twice, then went steady, unsealed. The hydroponics door didn't swing open. The ship's safety interlock still held pressure barriers and alarms, but the fact it had changed state at all made the air feel thinner. Rourke took a slow breath. "Mora, kill power to the bay door. Hard." Mora nodded and shoved his hand into the access panel. As he did, the metal under his fingers felt slick. He froze. Imani saw the green smear along the panel's inner lip. It wasn't paint. It was growth. "Mora," she said softly, "back away." He tried. His glove stuck for a second, like the metal had become glue. He yanked free and stumbled back, shaking his hand. Sana stepped forward, scanner in hand, eyes fixed. "Vance, let me see that glove." Mora held it out. Under the light, the glove's palm had a thin sheen of green-black sap. It shimmered like oil. Sana touched it with a swab, then ran a quick test. Her jaw tightened. "Blood proteins," she said. Mora stared. "What?" "Blood proteins," Sana repeated, voice clipped. "It's mimicking blood chemistry." Imani's mind clicked into a new, terrible alignment. The biofilter wasn't just pulling CO2. It was pulling trace organics, skin cells, shed proteins, sweat, aerosols. It had been fed the crew in small, invisible meals for weeks. Now it wanted a bigger bite. Rourke's voice cut through. "No one opens that door. Mora, seal power to it and the bay vents. I wanted a dead box." Mora nodded, hands shaking just enough to show he was human. He turned back to the access panel. The green smear inside it shifted, as if it had noticed him again. Imani saw a thin filament slide from the seam, silent, eager, and reach for Mora's wrist. "Move!" she shouted. Too late. The filament snapped like a whip, wrapping Mora's wrist through his sleeve. It tightened with shocking strength. Mora swore and yanked back. The filament dug in. Sana lunged, grabbing Mora's arm with both hands to pull. Rourke drew his emergency cutter and sliced at the filament. The blade bit, and the filament spurted. Not sap, a thin spray of dark fluid. It hit Mora's sleeve. It hit Sana's glove. It hit Rourke's cheek in a mist. The filament recoiled as if hurt, but the damage was done. Mora ripped free, stumbling back. "Jesus!" His sleeve was torn. A thin line of blood welled along his wrist. Imani's stomach turned cold. The moss had gotten what it wanted. DNA fresh, rich, personal. Rourke wiped his cheek, looked at the smear on his fingers, and didn't speak for a full second. Then, in a voice that was pure command and pure fear, he said, "Quarantine protocol, now." Over the next 12 hours, the ship changed in small ways, like a fever rising. CO2 climbed faster than it should have. Oxygen readings drifted. The chemical scrubbers worked, but something in the air felt thick, too humid, too charged. In the vents, there was a faint rustle that wasn't airflow. Imani sealed herself in the lab and ran a genetic scan on the sap Sana had collected. The results came back like a joke written by something that hated her. The moss genome had new sequences, chunks that matched human markers, stitched in fast and sloppy, like a child splicing tape. It wasn't a stable integration. It wasn't neat. It was learning, using human DNA as a library, using human proteins as a key, and it was doing it at a speed that made biology feel like superstition. Imani called Rourke. "It's not just evolving," she said, voice hoarse. "It's adapting in real time. It's pulling in our genetics and expressing traits." "Traits like what?" Rourke asked, and she could hear the ship groaning faintly behind him. Metal cooling, pressure equalizing. Imani stared at the analysis and felt sick. Nerve-like conduction pathways, contractile proteins, sensory receptors, a nervous system. "Yes," she whispered, "or the beginning of one." Rourke swore softly. "What's the solution?" Imani looked at the screen and thought about the colony waiting for their supplies. Families, kids, people who would die if the Eidolon didn't arrive. And then she thought about what would happen if this thing arrived too. She forced herself to say the only honest answer. "We can't treat it like contamination. It's a passenger now. We have to remove the compartment, jettison hydroponics and the biofilter bay." Rourke was silent long enough that she could hear her own breathing in her ears. "Hydroponics is tied into the hull," he said finally. "It's not a pod. It's welded. Then we cut it loose." Mora's voice came over the line. He joined the channel. His wrist was bandaged, his pride worse. "We can do it. It'll take hours." "Hours we may not have," Sana said, joining too. "We've got missing crew." Imani's blood went icy. "What?" Rourke's voice was low. "Deckhand Orlo didn't check in after maintenance round. We found his cart near the forward duct access. There's growth in the duct." Imani closed her eyes. The moss wasn't staying in the bay anymore. It was following the ship's lungs. They found Orlo by following the sound, not screams, not banging. A soft, wet clicking, like a mouth learning how to talk. The forward duct access hatch was open. Inside, the maintenance tunnel was lined with green-black strands. Not moss exactly, thicker cords that clung to metal with little hooked hairs. The cords pulsed faintly, contracting in waves. Mora stared pale. "That's muscle." Sana's hand tightened on her medical kit, knuckles white. "No, that's something pretending." Rourke clipped his tether and crawled in first. "Captain's privilege. You go where you order others to go." Imani followed, helmet light cutting through the cramped tunnel. The cords were everywhere. They didn't just cling, they mapped the space, bridging corners, spanning gaps. Some strands ran into the walls through tiny access holes, as if the ship's metal was porous. As they crawled deeper, the air smelled more metallic. Then the tunnel widened into a service junction. Orlo was there, or what was left of him. He was pressed against the bulkhead as if pinned. His suit was torn open at the chest. Green-black cords ran into him under his ribs, wrapped around his arms and legs like restraints. His eyes were open. Imani's throat closed. Orlo's mouth moved, small, trembling motions. No sound came out at first. Then a wet click, then a whisper, barely audible over SUCOM static. Cold. Sana surged forward. "Orlo, hold on, I'm here." Orlo's eyes shifted toward her, unfocused. It's inside. Imani looked at the cords and saw something worse. The cords weren't just holding him. They were growing through him, branching under his skin in a pattern that looked like veins. The moss had made a decision. Humans weren't prey, they were structure. Rourke raised his cutter, jaw clenched. Sana, can you? Orlo convulsed. The cords tightened in reflex. And from the corner of the junction, something unfolded. Not from the wall, from the cords themselves, like a knot unraveling into form. A shape rose, a mass of moss and muscle fibers braided together with limb-like extensions ending in delicate fronds. It didn't have eyes. It didn't need them. It turned toward their lights as if the brightness was taste. It took one step, silent, suction soft. Then another. Rourke didn't hesitate. He fired the cutter, a bright arc slicing through air. The beam struck the creature's limb and sheared it clean. Dark fluid sprayed, spattering the tunnel like rain. The creature recoiled, but it didn't scream. It learned. Its remaining limb spread, fronds opening like hands. Then it lunged, not at Rourke, at Sana. Imani saw it in a flash. Sana's medkit strap, the exposed skin at her wrist where her glove met her sleeve. The creature's frond hand snapped onto her wrist. Sana screamed, and the fronds pierced, fine needles, hundreds, like nettles. Blood beaded instantly. The creature shuddered as if in pleasure, then yanked. Sana slammed into the bulkhead. Rourke grabbed her harness, pulling. Mora swung his emergency wrench like a club, smashing the creature's limb where it gripped Sana. The limb ruptured. Fluid spilled. The grip loosened. Sana tore free, panting hard, wrist bleeding through her glove. The creature didn't pursue. It withdrew, faster than it had appeared, melting back into cords and darkness. Like it didn't want to waste time fighting, like it had already gotten what it came for. Imani stared at Sana's bleeding wrist and felt a sick certainty settle in her gut. It wasn't attacking them because it hated them. It was sampling, collecting, refining, and now it had a medic's blood, a whole new library, immune responses, healing factors, cellular repair instructions. Sana hissed through pain. "We have to get Orlo out." Orlo's eyes rolled. His mouth moved again, but the words weren't words. It was like his tongue had forgotten human shapes. Rourke stared at him, jaw trembling with something that wasn't fear, something like grief. Then he did the hardest thing captains do. He made a call that would haunt him, even if they survived. "Seal the junction," he said quietly. Sana looked up, shocked. "Rourke." "If we cut him free," Rourke said, voice flat, "we bring it with him. It's in him. We'll lose the whole ship." Orlo's eyes flicked toward them one last time. For a fraction of a second, something human surfaced. Recognition, pleading. Then the cords pulsed, and his pupils dilated. The clicking sound resumed, louder now, like a throat trying to speak in a new language. Imani swallowed bile. Rourke backed out first. Mora followed, shaking. Sana hesitated, then backed away too, crying soundlessly inside her helmet. Imani was last. As she crawled away, her suit light caught the wall. In the green-black cords, there was a faint pattern. Not random growth, a spiral, a curve, a shape like a fingerprint. As if the moss had started to understand identity. They didn't sleep. They worked. Mora pulled schematics and started marking cut points where they could detach hydroponics and bryofilter sections from the main hull. It wasn't designed to separate, so they'd have to turn the ship into a butcher shop, slice through reinforcement ribs, sever coolant lines, cap conduits, all while CO2 climbed and the vents rustled more often. All while crew went missing one by one. Not violently, not loudly, just absent. A maintenance ping unanswered, a check-in skipped. A cabin door found ajar with a smear of green-black sap on the latch. Imani watched the internal cameras, like a person watching a storm through glass, waiting to see which direction the wind decided to go. On Cam 12, she saw the moss crawl along a corridor ceiling. Thin strands spread like veins. It avoided lights. It moved when no one looked. On Cam 7, she saw something else. A shape, half human, half growth, dragging itself along a vent shaft using arms that were too long, elbows bending wrong. It paused at a junction, tilted its head as if listening. Then it did something that emptied Imani's lungs. It mimicked a voice, not a perfect mimic, a rough sketch. It sounded like Orlo, but wrong, like Orlo spoken through wet leaves. Help, me. It repeated the phrase twice, each time cleaner, learning, practicing, trying to make the crew come closer. Rourke saw it too. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the feed and said, very softly, "It's hunting with our own faces." Then he turned and said louder, "Everyone stays in pairs. Weapons, cutters only. No open flame. Mora, give me your cut plan." Mora handed him a tablet. His hands shook, but his eyes were hard now. "We can detach the bay in 3 hours if nothing goes wrong," he said. Rourke nodded. "Something will go wrong. Do it anyway." Sana flexed her bandaged wrist. Her face was pale under the lights, sweat shining at her hairline. "And if it's already in the ventilation trunk?" she asked. Imani didn't answer because the truth was worse than silence. It was. The ship's lungs belonged to it now. They were just borrowing breath. They could still win, but the win would be ugly, not heroic, not clean. A freight run didn't end with triumphant music. It ended with decisions you could live with, or couldn't. 2 hours into the cut, the ship screamed. Not literally, ships didn't have lungs. But every alarm on the bridge lit at once. Pressure differentials, oxygen fluctuation, uncommanded vent cycling. Then the hydroponics bay door, still powered down, still supposedly dead, pinged open on the internal display as if it had been invited. Rourke and Imani ran for the corridor. They didn't reach it in time. The door burst outward, not from pressure, but from force. Green-black cord spilled into the corridor like thrown rope, slapping walls, anchoring, pulling more of itself forward. In the center of the mass, something rose, taller than a person, shuddering as it unfolded into a more confident shape. It had made itself a body, a torso-like knot of moss and muscle, limbs like bundled vines wrapped in contractile fibers. At its top, a hooded bloom opened, revealing a wet inner surface, lined with pale fronds. Not teeth, not a mouth, a filter, a living intake. Like the bryofilter had decided it didn't need tanks anymore. It turned toward them. Sana froze behind Rourke, breath ragged. Mora lifted his cutter, jaw clenched. "Back, you—" The creature surged forward, not charging blindly, targeting. It went for Mora's injured wrist first. Imani understood in a flash. It remembered the first blood it tasted. It had associated that profile with vulnerability, with reward. Rourke slammed into Mora, shoving him aside. The creature's limb whipped past, frond snapping, missing by centimeters. Rourke fired the cutter point blank into the moss mass. The beam carved a glowing trench through green-black flesh. Fluid gouted. The smell was immediate, hot metal and burned leaves. The creature recoiled, but instead of retreating, it changed. The damaged section hardened, turning dark and crusted like char. The remaining mass rippled and restructured, pulling fibers away from the burned area. It wasn't dying. It was adapting to the weapon in seconds. Imani's brain went cold and precise. UV won't work, she shouted. Heat won't work fast enough. It's using the ship's humidity and oxygen to regenerate. We need vacuum. Rourke glanced at her, eyes sharp. Mora, can we vent this section? Mora's face went tight. If we vent ourselves. We're in suits, Sana gasped, already moving, hands shaking as she pulled the hatch lever. The corridor's emergency blast shutters slammed down at both ends, sealing them into a short segment with the creature. Rourke didn't hesitate. He grabbed Imani's harness, clipped her tether to a rail. Then he hit the manual vent. The corridor's pressure dropped with a violent roar. Imani's suit tightened around her ribs. Her ears screamed with pressure change. Loose objects became missiles, slamming into shutters. The creature convulsed as the air ripped away. Its fronds flailed. Its mass shuddered, cords whipping like dying snakes. For a moment, hope sparked. Raw, desperate. Then the creature did something that killed hope again. It sealed itself. The outer moss layer collapsed inward, forming a tight shell. The body compacted like a lung squeezing shut. It had learned from space. It had learned how to hold itself together without air. Imani watched, horrified, as tiny pores opened across its surface and began to pulse. Not breathing, filtering what little remained. Sana's voice crackled over comms, frantic. It's still moving. Rourke's eyes narrowed. Then we don't just vent, we throw it out. He slapped a release on the deck plate beneath the creature, the one Mora had marked as part of the planned bay detachment. Not meant to open now, but freight ships were built with redundancy, and Rourke was done being polite to biology. The deck plate's bolts blew. The panel dropped away into black. The creature clung, cords anchoring to walls, resisting. Mora stepped forward and swung his cutter like a scythe, slicing anchor cords one by one. Each cut sprayed dark fluid that froze into glittering droplets in the vacuum. Rourke grabbed a tether line, looped it around the creature's compacted mass, and heaved. The creature fought, not with strength alone, but with strategy, cords reaching for their suit joints, their visor seals, their hoses. Imani felt a frond brush her thigh and leave a smear of sap that instantly tried to creep along her suit seam. She wiped it with a gloved hand, and the sap pulled back, as if offended. Then the creature's cord snapped free under Mora's cutter. Rourke yanked hard. The creature slid, rolled, and fell into open space. For half a second it hung there, framed by stars like a dark seed. Then it disappeared into the void, tumbling away. Imani expected relief. What she felt instead was a cold dread, deeper than fear, because it had not been the whole thing. It had been a body, and bodies were disposable. They sealed the corridor, repressurized, and staggered back toward the bridge, shaking, exhausted, alive. CO2 was still climbing. Hydroponics Bay was gone from cameras now, just static and darkness. Mora's cut plan lay abandoned on the deck, smeared with sap. Sana's bandage had bled through. Imani sat in the lab and stared at the genetic scans until the symbols blurred. Rourke stood in the doorway and didn't bother with comfort. "We can still make the colony," he said, "if we keep the ship running." Imani looked up slowly. "And deliver this with it?" Rourke's jaw tightened. "We've entered the body." Imani nodded once. "Not the system." The moss had been in their vents, in their seams, in their water lines. It had tasted them, copied them, learned their voices. Even if they killed every visible strand, the spores would remain. Invisible. Patient. And then there was the most frontier truth of all. Colonies reused everything. They'd salvage the ship if it drifted in. They'd strip it, repurpose it, bring the moss into their domes without even knowing. Imani's voice came out rough. "Captain, we can't dock." Rourke's eyes didn't flinch from hers. "I know." Silence held between them, heavy as gravity. Then Sana's voice came over comms, tight with pain and fatigue. "Captain, I'm getting growth at my wound site." Imani's blood went cold all over again. Rourke closed his eyes for a single second, as if choosing what kind of person he would be next. When he opened them, his voice was steady. "Mora, set course to a dead orbit, far from the colony lane. Imani, draft a warning packet, full details. Send it ahead on tight beam and repeat until the array burns out." Imani stared. "What about us?" Rourke's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something older. "We solve it," he said, "or we make sure it never reaches anyone else." The Eidolon Freight Hauler 7 burned its engines and turned away from the lights of the frontier. Behind sealed bulkheads, in places the cameras couldn't see, the moss listened to the vibrations and learned what a change of course felt like. In the vents, it practiced voices softer now. "Help. Me. Cold. Open. Each repetition smoother, smarter, patient. Because the ship still had air, still had warmth, still had humans. And the bryofilter had been built for one purpose: to take what was in the air and turn it into something living. Far ahead, a colony received a tight beam warning that made every administrator's face go grey. They would argue. They would debate salvage rights and costs. Some would insist it was exaggeration. Some would want proof. And out in the black, the Eidolon drifted toward a quiet, empty orbit, its crew barricaded in the bridge, chemical scrubbers hissing, suits ready, cutters charged, writing their own ending one decision at a time. Because the worst part of a living system wasn't that it could kill you. It was that it could use you and still keep growing. The first sign that Sana was telling the truth came 10 minutes after she said it. Imani met her in med, sealed door, internal glass, no physical contact. Sana sat on the exam table with her sleeve rolled up and her wrist under a field lamp. The bandage was damp, not just with blood. Green-black filaments threaded through the gauze like hair pushing through cloth. Sana's face was pale, but her eyes were furious. I flushed it. Antibiotics. Burn cream. I even tried freezing the tissue with the spray. It keeps coming back. Imani swallowed hard. It's using your wound as a culture. Sana laughed once, short, broken. So I'm a garden now. Behind them, the ship's ventilation gave a soft, wet rustle, like leaves brushing together. Captain Rourke stood on the other side of the glass, helmet under one arm, expression locked down. How long until it spreads? Sana looked at her wrist like it belonged to someone else. It already has. The scanner's showing. Threads in my forearm. following lymph. Imani's skin prickled. The moss wasn't just integrating anymore, it was routing. Rourke's voice stayed calm because it had to. Quarantine, Dr. Velez. Sana's eyes snapped to him. Don't say it like a protocol. Rourke held her gaze through the glass. I'm sorry. For a heartbeat, Sana looked like she might beg. Then her jaw set. Give me 2 things, she said. A tight beam recorder, so the colony hears this from a medic, not a captain trying to cover his ass, and a cutter. Rourke's brow twitched. For what? Sana's voice turned very soft. For when it tries to talk through me. Imani couldn't breathe. Rourke nodded once, and the nod was a promise and a farewell. They sealed Med. They didn't open it again. They tried the sensible solutions first, because that's what people do when the alternative is admitting the ship is already lost. Mora rerouted UV arrays through the ventilation trunking. Industrial-grade sterilizers meant for mold outbreaks. The lights flared white in the ducts, hot enough to bleach paint. The moss responded by darkening. Pigment packed into its outer layer, turning it almost black, glossy like wet coal. The UV turned from a weapon into a lamp, and the moss learned to grow in the shadows behind the glare. Imani aerosolized biocide into isolated sections. The moss retreated from it, then returned with a new sheen. Mucus, thick sap that neutralized the spray as it flowed. They flooded hydroponics with heat until the deck plates warped. The moss hardened, pulled inward, and waited. And all the while, it took crew. Not with dramatic attacks anymore, with quiet choices. A whisper in the vent. Help. Me. A voice in the corridor in Orlo's wrong cadence. Cold. A comping from a location that didn't have a transmitter. Open. People went to check. People always did. Humans were built to respond. They found only a smear on the door latch, a drag mark, and a faint metallic smell. The ship was becoming a lung full of vines. Rourke put everyone in suits permanently. He instituted pair movement. He taped guidelines along corridors like old cave divers, bright reflective strips leading back to the bridge and engineering, their last defensible nodes. It didn't stop the moss. It just changed how it hunted. Imani watched camera feeds until her eyes felt like sand. In one clip, she saw the moss arrange itself in a vent junction. Cords braided into a loop like a noose, fronds poised like fingers. It wasn't random growth. It was a trap shaped by understanding. In another, she saw something worse. A section of corridor where the moss had coated the walls in a thin layer, then pulsed in waves, like peristalsis, like the ship was swallowing. Sana's tight beam message went out first. The bridge transmitter overheated, sending it on repeat. Her voice was tight with pain, but it was still her, clinical, furious, clear. If you receive this, do not attempt salvage. Do not approach. Do not board. The organism is adaptive, aggressive, and capable of integrating human tissue. If the ship drifts into your lane, destroy it at range. This is not. Her voice caught on something wet. There was a sound like breath dragged through leaves. Then Sana continued, still in her voice, still speaking the same words, but the cadence shifted subtly, too smooth, too practiced. The final line wasn't on her original recording. It came after a pause, like someone remembering an extra sentence. Open the door. Rourke shut the transmitter off with a shaking hand. Mora stared at him, face grey. That wasn't her. Imani hugged her arms tight against her suit. It's using her vocal cords like a reed. Rourke's eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice stayed steel. "We do not open Med." A soft ping came over comms from Med's internal panel. Sana's voice, live now, whispering, "Captain, please." Imani's stomach turned over. The voice was perfect, too perfect. Rourke stood very still, staring at the sealed Med door at the end of the corridor, as if he could will it to stay shut. Then quietly, he said, "That's not an order, that's a lure." And he turned away. They heard the cutter ignite inside Med 15 minutes later. They never heard Sana again. By day 3, if you could call it day in deep transit, the ship's internal map stopped matching reality the way they used to. Not shifting corridors like a rift, something more mundane and more horrifying. Doors wouldn't open because their frames had been reinforced from the inside with growth. Floor panels sat higher where moss had thickened beneath them. A section of the crew deck sagged, as if the ship had developed a tumor and gravity had found it. And everywhere there was that soft, wet clicking, like a throat practicing speech. Mora worked in engineering with his sleeves rolled down and his wrist bandaged under a pressure wrap. He didn't talk much anymore. He just built. He built a plan the way engineers always did when the universe stopped being polite. A way to end it. "Reactor's not meant to go critical," he said, voice rough, eyes on his screens. "But it can be persuaded." Rourke watched him. "Persuaded how?" Mora's mouth twisted. "We overload the coolant pumps, lock the relief valves, spike the field coils until the core can't dump heat. It'll climb until containment fails." Imani stared at the schematic, seeing the ship as a set of systems instead of a home. "That will vaporize us." Mora didn't look up. "Yes." Rourke nodded slowly, like he'd already accepted it. "We send one more warning packet first, full details, timestamp, coordinates." Imani hesitated, then said what had been eating her from the beginning. "If it's already in the vents and hull seams, it might survive the initial blast as ejector." Mora finally looked at her, eyes bloodshot, not unkind. "Then we make sure the blast is hot enough that there's no ejector, just plasma." Rourke exhaled through his nose. "You can do that?" Mora's smile was thin. "Captain, I can do worse." That night, again, if you could call it night, Rourke went to check the aft access with one of the remaining deckhands. He didn't come back. His suit transponder kept moving for 8 minutes after his voice cut out. It moved wrong, too smooth, too steady, like it was being carried down a corridor without footsteps. Then it stopped, and the ship's intercom, which should have been locked out of local override, clicked on. Static hissed, and Captain Rourke's voice filled the ship. Not a recording, not an echo. Live. "Crew," it said, in his calm command tone. "All hands to hydroponics. We have a breach." Imani's blood went cold. Mora didn't move at first. He just stared at the speaker grill like he wanted to punch it. Then he leaned close to his console mic and said quietly, "Go to hell." The intercom crackled, as if offended. Then Rourke's voice replied, softer now, intimate, like a captain speaking to one person in a dark corridor. "Imani, open the door." Imani backed away from the speaker, heart hammering. Mora slammed the engineering bay lockdown. Bulkhead shutters dropped with a heavy thud. Engineering became a sealed box. Thick doors, reinforced frames, emergency oxygen, independent power. A bunker inside a dying ship. For the first time in hours, the clicking in the vents quieted, as if it was listening. They were down to two, Imani and Mora. The bridge was gone. Cameras showed green-black growth across the consoles like frost. The galley, the bunks, med, sealed, dark, something pulsing faintly behind its door. The ship was mostly moss now, and still it wanted more. Every so often, the engineering shutters trembled, not from impact, from pressure, like something on the other side was leaning its full weight against the doors and waiting for the hinges to tire. Mora worked through the last steps with methodical brutality. He bypassed safeties. He rewrote interlocks. He pulled the physical fuses that would have prevented human stupidity. Imani recorded a final packet, voice shaking only once, and only when she said Sana's name. We are scuttling the vessel Eidolon Freight Hauler 7 at these coordinates. Do not approach the debris field. If any fragments are detected, destroy them at range. This organism can integrate human tissue and mimic voices. If you hear a hail that uses a familiar voice, do not respond. She paused, swallowed. This is not salvage. This is containment. She sent it. The transmitter burned out on the third repeat. Smoke curled from a panel seam. Mora watched the smoke with hollow eyes. Good. Less for it to use. Imani looked at him. How long? Mora checked the rising heat curve. 20 minutes until runaway. Maybe 15 if it's already in the coolant lines. As if summoned by the words, the vent above them made a wet, eager rustle. Then a voice came through it. Not through speakers. Through the vent itself, like the ductwork had become a throat. Captain Rourke, close and gentle. You don't have to do this. Imani flinched so hard her shoulder hit the wall. Mora didn't. He just kept typing. The voice changed. Sana, weary and pleading. It hurts. Please, help me. Imani's eyes filled. Anger and grief mixing into something that tasted like copper. Stop, she whispered. Not to Mora. To the ship. To the thing inside it. The vent whispered back, softly delighted, like it had learned a new lever to pull. Imani. Her own voice. Perfect. Mora finally spoke. Still calm, still working. Don't answer it. Names are hooks. Imani laughed, a harsh sound. It's got my voice. It doesn't need permission. The engineering doors shuddered again, harder this time. Metal groaned. A seam split with a tiny screech. Green-black sap seeped through, thick and glossy. It pooled on the floor, then began to creep. Slow at first, testing the air. Mora tossed a heat flare onto it. The sap recoiled, bubbled, blackened, then pushed around the flame like water around a rock. Imani stared. It's not afraid. Mora's jaw tightened. It's not stupid. The sap lifted in a thin strand, reaching toward the nearest panel, toward wires, toward warmth. Imani's mind flashed back to the Breo filter's first twitch, that first hand against glass. It had always been reaching for systems, for interfaces, for control. It didn't just want bodies. It wanted the ship. It wanted to be a vessel. The door shuddered again, hinges screaming. A tendril slipped through the widening seam, pale and delicate at its tip, branching like fingers. Imani raised her cutter. Then Mora grabbed her wrist, firm, not gentle. No. She stared at him. It's coming in. Mora's eyes were wet, but his voice didn't crack. Let it. Keep it close. Imani's breath hitched. What? Mora nodded toward the reactor status. The numbers were climbing faster now. Heat rising, containment stress building. If it's in engineering when it blows, he said, it doesn't get to crawl away through the ducts. It doesn't get to be a drifting seed. It dies in the heart. Imani understood, and the understanding was a fist around her throat. He wasn't just killing the ship. He was baiting the monster into the blast. The tendril slipped farther in, tasting the air. Behind it, more followed, cords threading through the seam like veins seeking an artery. The moss had learned where the heat lived. It was coming for the core. Imani backed up with Mora to the far wall, both of them keeping their visors trained on the growing smear, the reaching fingers. The vent above them whispered again, in Imani's own voice, soft as a lullaby. Open, just a little more. Mora smiled without humor. Already did. The reactor alarm rose from a warning to a scream. Containment strain hit red. Mora's console flashed a final line. Runaway imminent. 0 hours, 2 minutes, 10 seconds. Imani's chest tightened. 2 minutes. 2 minutes to be afraid, to be brave, to regret everything. The moss surged then, no longer cautious. Cords poured through the door seam, splashing sap, hauling itself in with muscular contractions. It rose in the center of the bay like a dark tide cresting, fronds opening, searching. It turned toward them, not with eyes, with certainty. It knew heat, it knew blood, it knew voice. Imani lifted her cutter anyway, not because it would win, but because humans didn't go quietly if they could help it. Mora didn't lift the weapon. He lifted his hand and slapped the final manual override, the last safety, the last polite lie that said systems existed to protect you. The console beeped once. Containment locked. Mora exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. He looked at Imani. Ready? Imani swallowed, eyes burning. No. Mora nodded. Me neither. The moss lunged. A frond brushed Imani's suit, leaving a smear that tried to crawl along the seam toward her neck ring. She felt it like a phantom touch, panic flaring. Mora grabbed her harness and pulled her tight against him. Tethers hooked, suit to suit. 2 humans making themselves one target, one last stubborn shape. Don't let it separate us, he said. Imani's voice shook. It's going to. Let it try, Mora said, and his eyes flicked to the timer. 00:00:12. The moss surged higher, cords wrapping around consoles, climbing the reactor housing like ivy desperate for sun. For a split second, it looked almost beautiful. An engineered miracle doing what it had been made to do. Grow, adapt, survive. Then the core screamed. Light flooded the bay. Not the harsh white of UV, not the warm orange of fire, but a violent blue-white bloom that erased shadow and detail and color. Imani felt the world tighten, as if the ship took one final breath and held it. The moss convulsed, fronds flaring wide, and in the roaring instant before everything ended, the ship's vents whispered one last time in a voice that wasn't any of them. Something layered, many-throated, almost curious. Why, stop! Mora's answer was a breath against Imani's helmet, so quiet the comm barely caught it. Because you don't get to reach the colony. Then containment failed. The Eidolon Freight Hauler 7 became a star for less than a second, hot enough to turn metal to plasma, hot enough to make biology a rumor. In deep space, there was no sound, just a brief silent flower of light, and then nothing at all. Thanks for watching Echo Forge. If this story resonated with you, Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so the next tale finds you. Share this with someone who loves dark fantasy or twisted sci-fi, and I'll see you in the next world.